Next, let's move on to what was going on in Texas. We'll take a look at some of the conditions that eventually led to the rebellion there. So in Texas, there was a social hierarchy amongst the Tejanos. And when I say Tejano, I'm talking about the Mexican settlers in the area. And so amongst the Tejanos, you had your elite rancheros, right? The ranch owners who had large acres of land and a lot of animals, and ranching pretty much was the main industry in Texas at that time. Then you had smaller ranch owners who had, medium-sized or small-sized ranches. They're still doing well. They own their own land and they're making a living there. And then you have the poor, and the poor are basically those who are working in the ranching industry. You have your cartmen. Cartmen are basically individuals who transport goods in carts, and those goods are coming from the ranches. So say the ranches have a bunch of products such as hides that need to be transported to the coast. The cartmen will throw those into their carts and travel all the way to the coast. They can make a pretty decent living doing that. It's a pretty lucrative industry. You have your vaqueros, basically your cowboys who worked on the ranches, and then you have your peons. The peons basically are your agricultural workers or your ranch workers, and they pretty much lived in a serf-like conditions, meaning that they were completely controlled by their bosses who they worked for. So if they wanted to travel to another place, they needed to get permission from their boss. If they wanted to get married, they had to get permission. That's like the conditions of serfdom in feudal Europe. And so that was going on in Texas amongst the Tejanos. All right, so those are the social and legal controls of the poor. The legal aspect is if one of the peons maybe committed a crime or was accused of a crime, their boss would act as a judge, right, and determine what would happen to them. Right, so not much of a legal system going on there in Texas at this time. But eventually the Tejanos will be joined by immigrants coming from the United States, and these are Anglo-American immigrants. Why are the immigrants being brought into Mexico, into Texas? Because the Mexican government and the Spanish government before them wanted to boost the economy in that region. Right, and so they figured they needed more people to do so, right? And so they would open up immigration to Americans. The way that they opened up immigration was through the impresario system. Impresarios were basically individuals who were given large grants of land, and then they were responsible for bringing in American settlers and selling that land to them. All right. Now, these impresarios were Americans themselves. An example of an impresario is Stephen Austin. Stephen Austin was given a huge grant of land, and he was supposed to bring in a bunch of immigrants from America, and he did. He did. All right. Who were these immigrants, though? What kind of people were they? Where'd they come from? Many of the immigrants came from the South, right? The Southern territories and states, which were kind of like frontiers at this time. So like the areas of Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, these areas, Tennessee, these areas were pretty much where most of the immigrants coming to Texas were from. And many of these people were in debt. Right? They were majorly in debt, and that's why they chose to come to Texas in the first place, because they were trying to get away from their debts, right? They just leave, right? So you just leave. You don't have to pay your debt. You don't have to go to jail for being a debtor, and that's why many of them came to Mexico, to Texas. Some other immigrants would also come, but not under the impresario system, right? They weren't legally, buying land from an impresario and moving to Texas that way. They came illegally, right? So you have some Americans who come illegally and they just squat on land, meaning that they didn't have legal title to that land, but they just set up their homes there. And many of these individuals were also coming from the South, but they were actual criminals, not just debtors. Some of them had committed crimes and they were escaping the law, and so they went to Mexico to try to get away from American officials. So the Mexican government wants Anglo-Americans to immigrate to Texas, but they want to control this immigration, right? It's not just completely open. And so they passed the Coahuila, Texas colonization law. And in this law, basically it provides that land will be sold to Americans at a very cheap price, right? Around 10 cents, maybe a little bit over 10 cents. And Americans will be forced to become Mexican citizens. They also have to become Catholic. Remember, a lot of Americans weren't Catholic, they're Protestant. So you got to become Catholic. You have to follow Mexican laws. And if you get married to a Mexican woman, you could be eligible to receive even more land. So there's an incentive for Americans to become assimilated into Mexican culture. That's what this colonization law is really trying to achieve. It's trying to control the Americans and turn them into Mexican citizens. Another big incentive for Americans to come to Texas is they are exempt from paying taxes for 6 years. All right, so that's not bad, especially if they're importing a bunch of goods from the U.S. No tariff or import taxes on those goods for 6 years. You also don't have to pay for your land for 4 years. Okay, so you eventually have to pay for the land that you get, but for 4 years those payments are held off. So those are major incentives to bring in Anglo-Americans into Texas. Some of the rules, though, of Anglo-American immigration is that settlers cannot settle too close to the border. Okay, they can't have too close relations with the United States, so that's why they are restricting where Anglo-Americans could settle in Texas. They don't want them close to the border with the U.S., and so they're trying to assimilate them into Mexican society. There's also limits on how much land Anglo-Americans can own. And finally, there is an establishment of the border with Texas. The border of Texas is the Nueces River. At that point, there's not supposed to be any Anglo-Americans settling down past that border region, okay, of the Nueces River.